The morning Maria Bell walked into Harlan Coop's funeral parlor with dried tears on her cheeks and a deed folded tight in her fist. She was not a woman asking for mercy. She was a woman buying herself one more sunrise before everything she had ever loved was swallowed whole by the Cattlemen's Bank of Caldwell, Kansas. It was the autumn of 1878, and the grasslands of southern Kansas were burning gold and rust the way they always did when the season turned, indifferent to the suffering of the small people who worked the earth beneath them. The town of Caldwell itself sat right on the edge of the Chisholm Trail, which meant it was a town built on motion, on cattle moving north and money moving fast and men who were here today and gone before the dust settled. It was not a town that had patience for grief. It was not a town that had patience for widows. Maria Bell was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for exactly 11 days. Her husband, Thomas Bell, had died of a fever that came on fast and cruel, the kind of fever that the frontier handed out without warning, without apology, and without remedy. They had called for the doctor, but Doc Hargrove was 2 towns over delivering a baby, and by the time anyone else could do anything at all, Thomas was gone. Just like that. 11 days ago he had been at the breakfast table, laughing at something their 6-year-old daughter Clara had said, and now there was nothing but a wooden cross in the hard ground behind the house, and a debt that Thomas had signed his name to 3 years prior when the drought came and took everything they had planted. The Bell farm sat on 40 acres east of town, good land when the rains came right, struggling land when they did not. Thomas had borrowed $460 from the Cattlemen's Bank at a rate that would make a reasonable man blush, and he had been paying it down slowly, steadily, the way he did everything with quiet determination and not enough room for disaster. The disaster came anyway. The debt remaining was $180, and the bank, in the person of its manager Albert Grady, had made it very plain that the 30-day grace period Thomas had negotiated the prior spring had expired at the end of September. Today was the 1st of October. Albert Grady had sent a formal letter, written in that particular cold and legal language that made a person feel like they were already nothing, informing Maria that unless the debt was settled in full, the deed to the property would be transferred to the bank. It was Harlan Coop, the Undertaker, who held the deed. Thomas had given it to him for safekeeping months ago when things got complicated with Grady, the kind of caution a man exercises when he senses a storm building on the horizon. Harlan was not a cruel man. He was a practical man, which in some ways is worse. He was also the town's notary, the one whose signature would finalize the transfer of the deed to the bank if Maria could not produce the money. So she had come to him first thing in the morning, before the sun was even fully up over the flat Kansas horizon, and she had stood in his doorway in her black morning dress with her dark hair pinned too hastily and her brown eyes raw from crying, and she had said the only thing she had left to say. "Mr. Coop, I am asking you to wait one more day. Just one. Give me until tomorrow morning." Harlan had looked at her over the tops of his spectacles with an expression that was not unkind, but was very tired. He was a thin man, tall, with fingers too long for his hands and a permanent smell of cedar, and something sharper that Maria had never wanted to identify too closely. He kept meticulous records, Harlan Coop. He kept meticulous everything. "Mrs. Bell," he said carefully, the way a man says something when he already knows what he is going to say but wants to give the impression of consideration. "Mr. Grady has been very clear about the timeline. The deadline was yesterday evening, technically speaking, and I have already been generous in not presenting the papers first thing this morning." "I know that," Maria said. She did not fidget. She held very still, the way she had learned to hold still under pressure, which was a thing the frontier taught women whether they wanted to learn it or not. "And I am grateful for that generosity. I am asking for more. One more day, until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Do you have reason to believe the money will come?" She had paused at that, and she had told him the truth, because lying to the man who held her deed seemed like a poor strategy. "I have written to my uncle in Wichita. I sent the letter 10 days ago. I have not received a reply, but the post is slow and my uncle is not a quick man with correspondence. I believe he will come or he will send something. You believe? Yes, Mr. Coop, I believe. Harlan had looked at her for a long moment, then looked down at his desk, then looked back up at her. One day, Mrs. Bell, I will tell Mr. Grady there was a complication with the paperwork. That buys you until tomorrow morning at 9. After that, I cannot hold it any longer. My professional reputation requires that I act in accordance with the legal agreements made. Thank you, she had said. And she had meant it with every hollow, exhausted fiber of her body. That had been at 7:30 in the morning. By 8 o'clock she was back at the farm, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara on her lap, the little girl warm and heavy and smelling of sleep, and Maria had held her daughter and stared at the wall and tried to think of what else could be done. Her uncle in Wichita was a real possibility, but it was also a thin one. He was not a wealthy man. He had a family of his own and a livery that did decent business in good years and poor business in bad ones. She had written him the truth of her situation, and she had asked plainly for help, and she had not heard back. She did not know if that meant the letter had not arrived, or if he was arranging things, or if he had read the letter and set it down and gone back to his breakfast. She had no other family. Thomas had a brother in Missouri, but he and Thomas had not spoken in 6 years over a land dispute that preceded Maria's arrival in anyone's life, and going to a stranger with her hat in her hand was not something she could bring herself to do. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She thought about the cattle. They had 3, which Thomas had been so proud of. 3 cattle did not pay off $180. She thought about the horses. 1 horse, a dun mare named Ellen, which she needed to get anywhere at all and which was worth perhaps $30 if she found the right buyer on the right day. She thought about everything in the house, every piece of furniture, every quilt her mother had sent her from Ohio when she and Thomas had married. She thought about Thomas's tools in the barn, his good saddle hanging on its peg, the silver watch that had belonged to his father and that now sat on the kitchen windowsill because Maria could not bring herself to put it away. None of it added up to $180. Clara tugged on her sleeve and asked if there would be eggs for breakfast, and Maria had said yes, of course there would be eggs, and she had stood up and gone to collect them with her daughter tottering behind her through the dewy grass, because a child needed breakfast whether or not the world was ending. The morning stretched out long and quiet. The sky was that clean, hard blue that Kansas did sometimes in October, the kind of blue that looked like it went on forever, and maybe it did. Maria hung laundry she had washed the day before, the simple work of it steadying her hands if not her heart. Clara played in the dirt near the porch, constructing some elaborate world with sticks and stones that she narrated in a running whisper to herself. It was just past noon when Maria heard the horse. She heard it before she saw it, the steady, measured beat of hooves on the dry road that ran along the north edge of their property, not rushing, not slow, just moving the way a horse moves when the rider knows where he is going and is not in a particular hurry to get there, but is not wasting any time either. She looked up from the sheet she was pinning and shaded her eyes with her hand against the October sun. The horse was a big bay, deep-chested and well-kept, the kind of animal that said something about the man riding it. The man himself was lean and broad-shouldered, wearing a duster that had seen considerable trail miles, a dark hat pushed back just slightly on his head, and the general aspect of someone who spent most of their life outside. He was trailing a second horse behind him, a gray pack horse loaded with gear, and as he drew even with the gate of the Bell farm, he slowed his bay to a walk and then stopped altogether. Maria stood very still between the laundry lines with a clothespin in her hand, watching him. He looked at the farm for a moment, then looked at her, then touched the brim of his hat in that minimal, economical gesture that passed for greeting on the trail. "Afternoon, ma'am. I'm looking for the Bell place. I was told in town it sat out on the East Road." His voice was steady and unhurried, with just a trace of something southern in it, Georgia perhaps, or Carolina, worn down by years and distance to something subtle. "This is the Bell place," Maria said. "I am Mrs. Bell." He held very still on his horse for a moment, something shifting in his expression in a way that was hard to read at the distance. "My name is Frederick Bailey, ma'am. I was a friend of Thomas Bell's. We rode together for about a season when I was working the Abilene drives back in '75. I heard he had settled down with a family and I've been passing through the territory, so I thought to stop and pay my respects." A pause. "I didn't know until I got into town that he had passed. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm genuinely sorry." Maria lowered the clothespin slowly. There was something in the way he said it, not the polished, rehearsed condolence that people offered at the funeral, the kind that slid off the surface of grief without touching it, but something simpler and more direct, like a man who meant exactly what he said. "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," she said. "Would you like to water your horses? I can offer you a meal if you have the time." He hesitated, the way a person does when they're not sure if accepting something is imposing or not. "I wouldn't want to be any trouble, Mrs. Bell." "You would not be any trouble," she said. "Company is not a burden right now." He dismounted then, and she saw that he was taller than she had gauged from a distance, with the particular kind of ease in his movements that came from a lifetime of physical work in open spaces. He tied both horses to the post near the water trough and lifted his hat to Clara, who had come to stand in the yard and was regarding him with the frank, unself-conscious scrutiny that small children apply to strangers. "Who are you?" Clara asked. "I'm Frederick," he said. "I was a friend of your papa's." "Papa is gone," Clara said, the way children say things that break adult hearts straight and plain as a nail. "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry about that." He said it to the child the same way he had said it to her mother. No performance, no condescension, just the plain thing. Maria got him water and then got him a meal, which was simple beans and cornbread and salt pork, the kind of food she could put together without thinking, and she was grateful for that because there was not much thinking left in her today. He ate with appreciation and without awkwardness, which was its own kind of relief. Clara sat across from him and asked him questions with the relentless curiosity of 6-year-olds, wanting to know how fast his horse could run, and whether he had ever seen a bear and what the farthest away place he had ever been was. "I've been to New Orleans once," he said, "which is very far away and very different from Kansas, and I've been up into Wyoming territory, which is also very far away and also very different. I think I prefer Kansas, though." "Why?" Clara demanded. "Because it's honest," he said simply. "There's nothing hiding in flat country. You can see everything that's coming." Maria, setting down a cup of coffee in front of him, caught his eye for just a moment, and something passed between them that she could not have named, a kind of recognition, perhaps, or just the shared acknowledgement that some true things land differently depending on where you are in your life when you hear them. They talked about Thomas. That was good. It was a kind of grief she had not had access to yet, the grief of someone who knew him in a different context, in the years before Maria, in the world of the cattle drives, and the open road that Thomas had told her about with the particular nostalgic warmth of a man who had been glad to leave that life behind, but also loved it in memory. Frederick Bailey had known that Thomas, and talking about him felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed too long. "He was the best card player on the whole drive," Frederick said, with a genuine, unguarded smile that changed his face considerably. He had a serious face at rest, not unfriendly, but reserved, the eyes dark and watchful and assessing everything the way trail men's eyes do. But when he smiled, something opened up in it. "And he was the worst liar I ever met," which made the card playing something of a paradox. You always knew when he had a good hand because he got very quiet and started looking at the ceiling. Maria laughed. She had not laughed in 11 days. The sound of it surprised her and surprised Clara, who looked up from her cornbread with wide eyes as if she had not quite been sure her mother still could. "That sounds exactly like him," Maria said. He used to try to tell me when the crop was failing that everything was fine, and I always knew because he got very interested in the grain of the wooden table. A good man, Frederick said, and the warmth in his voice was real and uncomplicated. A genuinely good man. Yes, Maria agreed. He was. The conversation found its natural ending, and then extended past it and found a new current. The way conversations do sometimes when the people having them are both surprised to discover how easy it is. They talked about the trail, about Caldwell, and the way the town had been growing since the railroad came through, about the cattle business, and whether the open range days were numbered now that the farmers were coming in with their fences. Frederick had opinions about all of these things that he offered without dogma, willing to be wrong, genuinely interested in what she thought. Maria found herself talking more than she had intended, offering her own perspective on things, the way she had done with Thomas and had not done with anyone since. It was mid-afternoon by then. Clara had fallen asleep on the parlor settee, which she did sometimes at midday, and the house had that particular golden, dusty afternoon quiet that Maria had once found peaceful and now found merely empty. She told him about the farm then. She was not sure why. She had not intended to, but perhaps it was because the afternoon had made her feel, for the first time in 11 days, like a person who could speak the whole truth of her situation to another person, and not have it simply be received with pity. She told him about the debt, about Elbert Grady, about her uncle in Wichita. She told him about Harlan Coop and the deed and the one-day grace she had been given. Frederick Bailey listened to all of it without interrupting, without the particular quality of listening where a person is composing their response while you speak. He listened the way a man listens when he is actually hearing you. "Tomorrow morning at 9, he said when she had finished. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does Grady owe the farm?" $180. "And you've had no word from your uncle?" "No word," she confirmed. He looked out the window at the afternoon light falling across the yard, at the 3 cattle standing near the fence in that patient, brainless way cattle have, at the barn with Thomas's tools inside it. He looked at all of it for a long moment. "I have money," he said. "I have been working drives for 3 years and living plain, and I have $240 put by. I would like to pay off the debt to the bank on your behalf." Maria went very still. "Mr. Bailey, I know what you are about to say," he said. "You cannot simply give a stranger $200. $180, he corrected, with a trace of the smile again. "And you are not a stranger. You are Thomas Bell's wife. Thomas Bell once sat up through an entire night with me when I had a bad fever on the trail outside of Newton, Kansas, and he never said a word about it afterward. He would not allow me to be in debt to him. He just said he was glad I was better. I have been owing that man something for 3 years, and I cannot pay it to him anymore." His voice was steady, but something moved underneath it, something genuine and a little raw. "Let me pay it to the farm he built." Maria's eyes had gone bright. She pressed her lips together and looked away from him for a moment, out at the yard, at Clara's little shoes left by the door, at the world that was somehow still turning despite having no earthly reason to. "I cannot accept charity," she said at last. "That is not pride talking, Mr. Bailey, or perhaps it is pride, but it is also sense. This farm needs more than one payment. The harvest was poor this year, the winter is coming, and without someone to work the land there will be another debt by spring. Paying the bank does not fix the farm." Frederick looked at her steadily. "No, it doesn't. So I thank you. I thank you genuinely and from my heart. But giving me the money solves the immediate problem and leaves all the others standing." "I understand that," he said. There was a pause then, a long one, the kind that had weight to it. "I have been thinking," Frederick said carefully, "for some time now, not since this morning, not since I came through that gate, but for some time, that I would like to stop moving. I am 32 years old, and I have been on the trail since I was 17, and I am tired in a way that a night's sleep does not fix." He paused again. "I am not making you any kind of proposal, Mrs. Bell. I would not insult your grief or your intelligence by doing such a thing today of all days. I'm simply telling you that if there were a farm that needed working, and if the arrangement were agreeable and proper and made sense to both parties, I would not be opposed to putting down roots. That is all I am saying." Maria looked at him for a long time. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Clara. She thought about the $180 and the deed and Harlan Coop's tired eyes over the tops of his spectacles. She thought about the spring planting and the winter ahead and the empty chair at the breakfast table. "That is a great deal to say with those few words," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed, "I suppose it is. I will think about it," she said, "tonight. And in the morning, Mr. Bailey, if you are still of a mind to help, I would be grateful for the company to the bank." He nodded once. "I'll make camp near the creek if that's all right. I won't impose on the house." "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "The nights are getting cold, and I would not send a person to sleep under the open sky in October when there is a perfectly good barn." He accepted that with a nod and a quiet thank you, and Maria Bell watched him cross the yard to tend to his horses and felt something shift inside her chest that she was not quite ready to name. She did not sleep well that night, but that had been true of every night for 11 days, and at least this sleeplessness had something different in it. Not just the hollow, ringing grief of before, but also a complicated tangle of thoughts that were at least forward-facing. She lay in the dark and listened to Clara breathing in the trundle bed beside her, and she talked to Thomas in her head, the way she had been doing since he died, that one-sided conversation that was somehow comforting despite its one-sidedness. She asked him what he thought about Frederick Bailey. She told him what Frederick had said about the fever outside of Newton, and she could imagine so precisely the way Thomas would have looked hearing that story retold, that slightly embarrassed, dismissive wave of his hand, "it was nothing," that meant the world to him. She told him about the money and the offer and the long pause in the kitchen. She told him she was frightened. She had not said that out loud to anyone since he died. She was frightened of losing the farm, frightened of what came after if she did, frightened of raising Clara in a rooming house in Caldwell or going back to Ohio with nothing, frightened of the winter and the next harvest and the one after that. And she was frightened, too, in a different and more complicated way, about the man sleeping in her barn, because she had not expected to meet anyone who made grief feel, for the space of a few hours, slightly less total. She lay awake and thought all of that through until the sky began to go gray in the east, and then she got up and made coffee and eggs and biscuits, because whatever was going to happen today was going to happen on a full stomach. Frederick Bailey came to the back door just before 7, his hat in his hands, his dark hair damp from the creek. He looked at the table set for 2 adults and 1 child, and he looked at her, and he said simply, "Good morning, Mrs. Bell." "Good morning, Mr. Bailey," she said. "Sit down." Clara came down in her nightgown and climbed into her chair and announced that she was hungry and also that she had dreamed about a horse with silver hooves, and Frederick told her that there was a story among the ranchers up in Wyoming territory about a horse like that, and Clara immediately needed to hear every detail, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary human warmth of voices and breakfast and morning light coming through the east window. Maria watched it all and felt the pain of it and the strange comfort of it at the same time, the way grief and life insist on existing in the same space, whether you want them to or not. After breakfast, when Clara was dressed and occupied with her morning tasks, feeding the chickens was her responsibility, and she took it with immense seriousness. Maria and Frederick sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee, and she said what she had worked out in the night. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday, about stopping, about roots." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I am going to be honest with you, Mr. Bailey, because Thomas always said that the most useful thing you can do with another person is be honest with them, and I think he was right. I do not know you. You knew my husband, which speaks to your character, but I do not know you myself. And I have a daughter to think about before I think about anything else. She comes first in every consideration." "As she should," Frederick said quietly. And there is the grief, Maria continued. I am 11 days from Thomas's death, and whatever I feel or think or imagine right now is not entirely to be trusted, because grief changes the world and it changed me, and I cannot promise you that the woman sitting here today is the same woman who will be sitting here 6 months from now. I understand that, he said. But, she said, and paused and looked at him directly. He had very dark eyes. She had noticed the kind that were hard to read quickly but rewarding if you looked longer. But the farm is real and the debt is real and the winter is coming and Clara needs a home. And you are the kind of person, from what I saw yesterday and this morning, that Thomas chose for a friend, which is not nothing. Thomas chose his friends carefully. She set down her coffee cup. I would like to accept your help with the bank today. And I would like to, if you are willing, and if it seems to both of us as the weeks go on that it makes sense, to explore what a more permanent arrangement might look like. Not a promise, not a proposal, just the door left open. Frederick Bailey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That is the most honest and clear-eyed thing anyone has said to me in years, Mrs. Bell. Maria, she said, if we are going to go to the bank together, you might as well call me Maria. Maria, he said, and the way he said it was careful and respectful and somehow felt like the beginning of something. Then you should call me Frederick. She picked up her coffee cup again. Frederick, finish your coffee. We have a bank to deal with. Caldwell was about 2 miles east on the road, and they rode in together, Maria on Ellen the dun mare and Frederick on his big bay. Clara perched in front of Maria, and chattering about the grasshoppers she could see in the dry yellow fields on either side of the road. The October morning was bright and cool, the air carrying that particular clarity that came after the first cold nights, and the town rose up ahead of them in the way small Kansas towns do, all at once, suddenly, a cluster of wood and dust and noise and life in the middle of a great deal of nothing. Caldwell in 1878 was a busy place. It had been one of the main trail towns on the Chisholm route, and while Dodge City to the west had taken some of the cattle trade, Caldwell was building its own identity as a serious town. There were several good businesses along Main Street, a hotel, a hardware store, Simmons's general merchandise store, 2 saloons, one respectable, one less so, and the Cattlemen's Bank, which sat in a brick building at the corner of Main and 2nd that was aggressively solid in a way that was meant to convey permanence and authority. It succeeded. Elbert Grady was at his desk when they came in, a compact, self-satisfied man in his 40s with close-cut side whiskers, and the particular manner of someone who has spent his career in a position that gives small power over other people, and has come to enjoy it considerably. He looked up when Maria came through the door, and his expression arranged itself into something that was professionally sympathetic and privately satisfied, the expression of a man who expects to have a good day. Then he saw Frederick behind her, and the expression underwent a slight recalibration. Mrs. Bell, he said, rising, I was not expecting a meeting this morning. I understood from Mr. Coop that there was a paperwork complication. I'm prepared to move forward with the transfer of the deed at your convenience. There will be no transfer, Mr. Grady, Maria said. She was composed. She had made herself composed on the road into town, had looked at the blue sky and the yellow grass and Clara's small, warm weight against her, and had assembled herself into the person she needed to be for this moment. I am here to pay the remainder of the debt in full. Grady blinked. I beg your pardon. Frederick stepped forward and set a leather pouch on the banker's desk with the quiet, settled weight of a man who has made his decision and is fully committed to it. $180, he said. I'll have a receipt, and I'll have the lien on the Bell property cleared in writing before we leave this office. Grady looked at the pouch, then looked at Frederick, then looked at Maria. He was the kind of man who processed unexpected developments by looking for the angle in them, and he was clearly not finding one he liked. And you are, he asked. Frederick Bailey, Frederick said. I am an associate of the Bell family. Grady picked up the pouch and opened it with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who is counting not just money but time, trying to find the error or the loophole that would let him proceed as he had planned. He counted the coins and bills slowly twice. He found no error. "This is in order," he said, with the particular tone of a man who is not pleased that things are in order. "I will have the papers drawn up." "Thank you," Maria said. She said it with a courtesy that was absolutely sincere and contained not a single gram of triumph or gloating, which was harder than it looked because what she felt inside was a trembling, relieved joy that she was keeping under very careful control. They waited while the papers were drawn. Grady's clerk, a young man named Aldous who clearly found the whole proceeding uncomfortable, scratched at his forms with careful handwriting while Grady stood by the window and looked out at Main Street with the expression of a man contemplating a universe that has failed to cooperate with him. Frederick stood near the door. Maria stood near the desk. Clara, who had been told to behave and was doing a creditable impression of it, sat on the wooden bench along the wall and swung her feet and looked at everything with her large, curious eyes. When the papers were done, Grady presented them with cold professionalism. Maria read every word. She had always read every word of every document, which had been one of the things about her that Thomas had initially found surprising and then deeply appreciated. And then she signed where she was required to sign, and Frederick signed as witness, and the lien on the Bell property was formally and legally extinguished. Harlan Coop came in just as they were finishing. He had clearly been told about the meeting, probably by Grady, probably hoping for a different outcome, and he stood in the doorway with his long fingers and his tired eyes and looked at the signed papers and then at Maria and then at Frederick, and something in his face shifted into something that might have been relief. "I am glad to see this resolved, Mrs. Bell," he said, and he meant it. Whatever he was, Harlan Coop was not a man who enjoyed watching widows lose farms. "Thank you for the day, Mr. Coop," Maria said. "It made all the difference." She walked out of the Cattlemen's Bank of Caldwell, Kansas at 10 minutes past 11 in the morning on the 1st of October, 1878, with the deed to her farm secure and Frederick Bailey walking beside her and Clara taking her hand on the steps and swinging it cheerfully, already asking about lunch. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of careful. Frederick stayed on at the farm, sleeping in the barn as he had that first night, and the work he put into the place in those first weeks was the kind of work that spoke louder than any conversation could have. He repaired the section of fence on the north side that had been failing since summer. He rehung the barn door that had been swinging wrong on its hinges and grinding against the frame every time the wind came up. He winterized the water pump and stacked firewood in a quantity that Maria had been worrying about since September and had not had the energy to fully address. He checked the cattle for signs of the scours and found early evidence in the youngest, caught in time to treat. He did all of this without discussion, without announcement, without the air of a man expecting gratitude for doing things that simply needed doing. That quality in him, that practical, unself-conscious competence, was one that Maria found herself noticing, and then found herself thinking about noticing, which was its own development. They talked in the evenings. After Clara was put to bed and the lamps were turned down, they would sometimes sit at the kitchen table with coffee or sometimes on the porch when the night was not too cold, and they would talk. Not about the future. They had an unspoken agreement, it seemed, that the future was not a topic yet, but about everything else. About the places he had been and the things he had seen. About her growing up in Ohio, the youngest daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had opinions about literature and pressed flowers. About the cattle business and the changes coming and whether the railroad was going to change everything forever or just most things. About Clara, who was becoming, in Frederick's obvious and genuine affection, something that complicated Maria's heart considerably. He was good with her daughter. Not in the performing way of a person trying to demonstrate that they were good with children, but in the natural, easy way of a man who simply liked her, and found her interesting, and treated her with the fundamental respect that children always know when they are receiving it, and respond to accordingly. Clara, for her part, had adopted him into her world with the completeness that small children bring to these decisions, showing him her rock collection, explaining to him at length the social dynamics of the chickens, requesting that he teach her to whistle, and asking him every few days at breakfast whether he was going to stay. Frederick always answered that question carefully. He said he planned to stay, that he liked it here, that the farm was good and the work suited him. He never overpromised to a 6-year-old, which was its own kind of honor. Maria saw all of this and was moved by it in ways that she was still learning to account for. It was 3 weeks after the bank, on a Tuesday evening in late October, when something changed between them. They were on the porch. The night had come in cold and clear, the kind of cold that had stars in it, and they could see the Milky Way in its full breadth overhead, which was one of the things about Kansas that Maria had never once stopped finding astonishing, that sky, that enormous, indifferent, magnificent sky. They had been talking about, of all things, the question of whether the railroad would change the price of cattle by spring, which was a very practical conversation, and then Frederick had fallen quiet in the middle of it, looking up at the stars rather than at her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" He looked at her then. "Not the farm, not the debt, not the practical things. Are you all right?" No one had asked her that, not since Thomas died. People had asked about the farm and the money and what she needed practically, and they had offered condolences that were sincere and kind, but no one had asked simply, plainly, whether she herself was all right. She considered lying, the way one does. She considered saying yes, she was fine, she was managing, she was getting on. But she looked at him in the porch lamplight, and something in his face, the patient, undemanding quality of it, the willingness to receive whatever she actually said, made lying feel not just dishonest but wasteful. "No," she said, "I don't think I am. Not yet." He nodded as if this were not surprising, not alarming, just the truth of things. "Do you want to talk about it, or do you just want it acknowledged?" Maria felt the sting in her eyes before she could stop it. "Just acknowledged, I think, right now." "Then it's acknowledged," he said. "What you are going through is real, and it is hard, and you are carrying it well, and it is still very heavy." She pressed her lips together and looked away from him, out at the dark yard. "He was a good man," she said. "I keep thinking that. Not that I had a good marriage, though I did, but just that he was a good man who did not deserve to die at 31. He had so much more he wanted to do. He wanted to expand the herd. He wanted to put in an orchard. He had this idea about apple trees which seemed impossibly optimistic for Kansas, but he was always like that. He believed things could work if you put the work in, and he was right mostly. He just did not get enough time for it." "No," Frederick said quietly, "he didn't." "I am angry about that," she said. "I have not said that to anyone. I am angry that he got a fever and died and there was nothing anyone could do about it, and I am angry that the bank was right there with their paperwork, and I am angry that the world just kept going. I am angry that the sun kept coming up." She paused. "That is not reasonable. Grief is not required to be reasonable," he said. She looked at him. "No. I suppose it isn't." They sat for a while longer, the cold deepening around them, the stars burning steady and cold overhead, and something between them settled into a different kind of ease, the ease of two people who have passed through something true together and come out the other side understanding each other slightly better than before. November came, and with it the first hard frosts. Frederick and Maria fell into a rhythm that was so natural and so domestic, and so quietly sustaining that Maria sometimes stopped herself in the middle of it to recognize what it was. Mornings were for the barn and the animals and the kitchen, working alongside each other with the comfortable wordlessness of people who have learned each other's rhythms. Clara was in school most days, the schoolhouse in Caldwell, which she walked to with Mrs. Kimball's children from the neighboring farm, and those hours gave the farm a particular quiet that was different from the lonely quiet of October. It was a working quiet, a purposeful quiet. There were moments, more as November went on, when Maria became aware of Frederick Bailey not just as a good, steady presence, but as a man specifically, which was a different thing and a more complicated one. The way he stood in the barn doorway in the winter light, the sound of his voice reading to Clara from her schoolbook in the evenings, the particular patience of his hands when he was working on something difficult. She found herself thinking about these things at odd moments, and then thinking about what it meant that she was thinking about them, and then reproaching herself for the analysis, and then returning to the analysis anyway, because the heart is persistent and not particularly deferential to the head's schedule. She did not rush it. She did not rush any of it. She was not the kind of woman who rushed, and grief had slowed everything to a pace that was part necessity and part necessity become habit, and she let it be slow. She trusted it more when it was slow, but she also could not ignore what was happening, which was that she was not only grateful for Frederick Bailey's presence on this farm, but was beginning to want it in a way that had nothing to do with practicality. She liked talking to him. She liked the way he thought and the way he listened, and the way he was quietly, completely honest in all his dealings. She liked that he was kind to Clara without performance. She liked that he had sat beside her on the porch that October night and asked if she was all right, and then simply held the space for what she had said in it. She liked him. It was as simple and as complicated as that. It was Frederick who moved first, and he moved the way he did everything, quietly, directly, without theater. It was the second week of November, a Sunday afternoon. The farm settled in its winter quiet, Clara napping after church, and Maria was sitting at the kitchen table writing a letter to her uncle in Wichita. Not the letter of a desperate woman asking for rescue now, but a genuine letter, telling him that things had been resolved, and she was well, and that she hoped to visit in the spring. Frederick came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin, and then, instead of going to the sitting room with the newspaper as he usually did on Sunday afternoons, he sat down across from her at the table. She looked up. He was looking at her with that direct, still quality that she had come to know, the way he looked when he had something true to say and was deciding how to say it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, setting down her pen. "I came through Caldwell on the old trail," he said, "because I told myself I was passing through to visit Thomas Bell out of respect, and that was true. But I think I was also, I have been thinking about this, looking for a reason to stop. Not any reason. I was not going to stop just anywhere, but I think somewhere along the road, without quite admitting it to myself, I was looking for something that felt worth stopping for." He paused. "What I found here, the farm, yes, but more than the farm, has been more than I expected, more than I knew I was looking for." Maria was very still. "I am not a dramatic man," he continued. "I am not going to tell you things I don't know to be true. I don't know the future. I know that every day I am here I am more certain that I would like to stay, and I know that that certainty has more to do with you than with anything else. The way you carry yourself, the way you talk, the way you love your daughter. The way you—" he stopped, tried again. "The way you sat in that banker's office and read every word of those papers before you signed them, and I thought, that is someone who takes herself seriously in the right way, in the way that deserves taking seriously in return." Maria's throat was tight. She did not look away from him. "I am not asking anything that you are not ready to give," Frederick said. "I know that Thomas is recent and that grief takes the time it takes, and I am not asking you to rush anything or decide anything today. I am only telling you where I stand, because I thought you deserved to know, and because I think you are the kind of person who would rather have the truth plainly given than hinted at." She took a breath, let it out. "You are right that I am that kind of person," she said at last, "and I will give you the truth plainly in return." She met his eyes. "I am not over my grief. I do not know when I will be, but I know that I look forward to mornings because you are there. I know that when something happens that is interesting or funny or worth remarking on, you are the first person I want to tell it to. I know that Clara has not asked about you leaving in 2 weeks, which I think is because she is afraid of the answer. And I know that when I imagine that answer being that you are going, something in me objects very strongly." She paused. "I am telling you this carefully, Frederick, not as a promise, not as an arrival, but as I am somewhere on the road toward you. I cannot tell you how far. I can tell you that I am walking." He looked at her for a moment, and his face did that thing it did when he smiled, that opening, that warmth, but it was not quite a smile. It was something beyond a smile, something more internal and more real. "That is enough," he said. "More than enough." December came and the winter settled in earnestly. The Kansas cold that was not as dramatic as further north but had its own flat, relentless character. The wind coming off the plains without obstacle, carrying the temperature right through the walls and into the bones of everyone who tried to stand up to it. The farm was warm. Frederick had done the job with the firewood and the weather stripping on the windows and the chimney. And the kitchen was warm and the parlor was warm. And Maria and Clara and Frederick lived through that December in the particular insulated intimacy of a small house in a cold winter, which has the effect of making people either very irritable with each other or very close, and in their case it was the latter. There was a Christmas. Maria's uncle from Wichita did come after all. His name was Henry Marsh, a stocky, direct man in his 50s with a gray beard and kind eyes, who arrived on the train 3 days before Christmas and immediately understood the situation with the particular perceptiveness of a man who had spent his life reading horses and people. He and Frederick shook hands and measured each other in the way men do, not with aggression but with assessment. And by the second evening, they were drinking coffee at the kitchen table, talking about the cattle market, with the easy familiarity of people who respect each other's competence. On Christmas morning, Clara found an orange in her stocking, a genuine orange, which was the thing Frederick had ridden into town for 2 days earlier. Not the tools or the flower, but the orange, because he had thought about what Clara would find most miraculous and had gone to find it. And her face was something Maria would carry for the rest of her life. Henry Marsh brought a small garnet brooch that had been Maria's mother's, retrieved from the family in Ohio, and Maria held it in her palm and cried without any embarrassment, and Frederick sat beside her on the settee and handed her his handkerchief and kept his hand very lightly near hers on the cushion between them. Not touching, just present, and Henry watched all of this and said nothing, and later told Maria privately that Thomas would have approved. Uncle Henry left on the 27th, hugging Maria for a long time in the cold on the platform, and telling her in her ear that she was stronger than she knew, and that whatever she chose to do she should do it without apology. She held on to him and nodded and did not cry this time, and watched the train carry him back to Wichita, and turned around and found Frederick and Clara waiting with the horses. Clara already complaining that her toes were cold, and she walked back to them and took her daughter's hand, and they went home. January was cold and February was worse, but the farm held and the animals were healthy, and the food stores that Frederick had helped build up through the fall were sufficient, and there was a settled quality to their days that was new and real and increasingly necessary. Maria had begun to recognize slowly, then all at once, that what she felt for Frederick was not gratitude, and it was not practical arrangement, and it was not the confused rebound sentiment of a lonely, grieving woman. She knew what those things felt like in their component parts. This was something else. This was the particular and specific thing that happens when you meet someone whose company makes you more yourself rather than less, whose presence in a room you notice with something like relief, whose voice you want to be the last sound before sleep. She had been thinking about this for weeks, running it around the inside of her mind the way you run a river stone between your fingers, something you pick up for its smoothness and end up not being able to put down. It was a Sunday evening in late February. Clara was asleep. The fire was low in the parlor, just coals and the occasional flicker, and they were sitting together on the settee, not close, the way they never were deliberately close in the early weeks, but closer than they had been before, the winter having moved them together by its own gentle and irresistible physics. They had been talking about the spring planting, about the apple trees Thomas had wanted, about whether the soil on the east end of the property was right for fruit and whether it was worth trying. He would have tried, Maria said. Thomas would have tried it regardless of whether the soil was right. He believed in trying things. That's a good quality, Frederick said. Yes, she said. She looked at the coals. I have been thinking about him differently lately. Not less, but differently. When it was very fresh, thinking about him was like putting my hand on a stove. Now it is more like it's still warm. It still hurts sometimes, but the pain has changed shape. It has become more like love than like loss. Does that make any sense? Complete sense, Frederick said quietly. I don't want to stop grieving him properly, she said. I don't want to move so fast through it that I do him a disservice. I don't think you could, Frederick said. I have watched you grieve for 4 months, Maria. You have not done Thomas Bell any disservice. She turned to look at him then, and they were close enough that looking at him directly was different than it had been before, closer, more conscious, more charged with the awareness of everything that had been said and not said between them. I am ready, she said. I am telling you that I am ready. He looked at her. The firelight was low and warm on his face. Ready for what exactly, he asked, and his voice was very careful, very steady, giving her all the room in the world. For this, she said, for whatever this is, I don't have different words for it than that. I'm ready to stop walking on the road toward you and simply arrive. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand very gently, the way you hold something that matters, and he said, "Then here I am." She looked at their hands together, his large and trail-roughened and warm, her smaller and work-worn and certain, and she felt the weight of the past 6 months in it, and the weight of everything Thomas had been, and the weight of everything ahead of them, and she felt all of it without flinching, because it was all real and it was all hers. I should tell you something, he said, something I have been thinking about for a while. Tell me, she said. I would like to marry you, he said. Not this minute, not in a hurry. But I would like to. I would like to make this, all of it, the farm, Clara, you mine properly and officially and in the sight of the town and God and everyone else. I would like to be the man who gets to stay. He paused. I have never wanted to stay anywhere in my life until now. I am telling you that so you understand what I mean when I say it. Maria Bell looked at Frederick Bailey in the firelight of a February evening in 1879. In the house Thomas Bell had built on 40 Kansas acres, and she felt the thing inside her chest that she had been carrying for months finally, fully, settle into something that was not tentative and not afraid and not anything other than certain. Ask me properly, she said. He gave her that smile, the full, warm, opening one. Then he turned to face her directly and said with complete simplicity, Maria Bell, will you marry me? Yes, she said. Yes, I will. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm dimness of the parlor, and outside the Kansas wind was moving across the flat land the way it always did, indifferent and constant, and inside everything was still. They told Clara in the morning. They sat with her at the breakfast table with her oatmeal and her orange juice, and Maria said, with the directness that 6-year-olds deserve, Clara, Frederick has asked if he can be your papa, and I said yes, and we would like to know what you think. Clara looked at Frederick with her large, solemn eyes for a period that felt considerably longer than its actual duration. Then she said, you have to teach me to whistle. You promised. I did promise, Frederick agreed gravely. And I will. Then yes, Clara said, and returned to her oatmeal as if this were a matter thoroughly settled, and neither Maria nor Frederick could look at each other for a full 30 seconds without crying. They were married in April, when the Kansas spring came in with the green and the wind and the particular wild, tentative beauty of a land that has survived another winter and is not going to make a fuss about being glad of it. The ceremony was in the white clapboard church on the south end of Caldwell's Main Street, performed by Reverend Elias Holt, who had a long beard and a kind manner, and who spoke the words with the weight they deserved. Henry Marsh came from Wichita on the train, arriving the day before with a bottle of good Tennessee whiskey and his eyes already suspicious of redness. Mrs. Kimball from the neighboring farm came, and several of the families from the community who had watched this whole winter with the benevolent interest that small communities take in the affairs of their members. Maria wore her best blue wool dress, which was not a wedding dress in the conventional sense but was the best she had, and she wore her mother's garnet brooch at her collar, and when she walked down the aisle of that simple prairie church on her uncle's arm and saw Frederick standing at the front in a dark coat that was clearly new and slightly too stiff at the shoulders, looking at her with that expression she had come to know, the still, warm, entirely present look, she felt something complete within herself. Like the closing of a circle, she did not feel that she was replacing Thomas. She had understood, through the winter's long thinking, that that was not how it worked, that love was not a finite quantity parceled out in single allocations, that grieving one person and loving another were not in competition. Thomas had her whole love, the love of a wife and a partner and a widow who would carry him in her heart for the rest of her days. Frederick had her whole love, the love of a woman who had come through loss and found to her surprise and gratitude and joy that she was still capable of the full thing. The Reverend said the words. They said yes. They were married. The reception was at the farm, which felt right. Henry Marsh gave a speech that was short and honest and made everyone laugh and several people cry. Mrs. Kimball brought a layer cake of astonishing architectural ambition. Clara wore her good dress and a wreath of early spring flowers in her hair and attached herself to Henry Marsh's side for most of the afternoon because she had decided she liked him and intended to get everything possible out of the visit. Frederick danced with Maria in the barn, which had been swept clean for the occasion, with Henry Marsh playing a fiddle that he turned out to have been carrying in his bag the whole time without saying a word about it. And the music was real, and the dancing was a little inexpert and completely joyful, and Maria laughed in a way she had not laughed since before Thomas died. Not the controlled, careful laugh she had been producing when appropriate, but the real thing, unguarded and full, with her head thrown back and her eyes bright. Frederick looked at her laughing and she saw his face and what was in it, and she knew that whatever came next, however the years went, this was a man who would look at her like that for the whole of their life together. The summer of 1879 brought good rains after the dry years, and the Bell farm, they kept the name Bell on the property. Maria wanted that, and Frederick never raised any question about it, prospered in a way that felt like the land itself was cooperating with the effort they were putting in. The cattle herd grew to 7 by fall. Frederick planted the apple trees on the east field, 12 of them, which was wildly optimistic for the climate and the soil, but which Thomas Bell would have been proud of, and by some combination of stubbornness and good luck and meticulous care, 9 of them took root and survived the winter and came up with tiny leaves in the spring of 1880. Maria kept her own careful books. She had always been the one who managed the farm's accounts, and she continued to manage them, and they told a story that got a little better every season. By the end of 1879, the farm was not only out of debt, but had a small surplus that she documented with a private satisfaction that was not about money, but about proof. Proof that it could be done, that the land could be worked and the work could pay, and the worst days were not permanent. There was a morning in the summer of 1879, about 3 months after the wedding, when Maria came downstairs before anyone else was up and stood in the kitchen in the early light. Looking at the way, the sun came through the east window and fell on the kitchen table where they had all sat and eaten breakfast together the morning before, and she felt the full weight of what her life contained at that moment. The loss that was still real and carried, the joy that was also real and present. The farm that stood firm beneath her feet, the man sleeping upstairs who had come through on a horse on a noon in October and changed everything, and she thought, Thomas wanted apple trees. There are apple trees now, And she cried, but they were the kind of tears that are not only grief but also gratitude, the mixed kind, the human kind. Later that year, in October, exactly 1 year after Frederick had ridden up to the gate, Maria told him that there would be a baby in the spring. She told him at the kitchen table. In the morning, the way she had decided was the right place and time for important things, and he had gone very still the way he did, and then something had broken open in his face that was more joy than she had ever seen on it, and he had come around the table and taken both her hands and kissed them and said her name in a way that made it sound like the most important word in any language. "A baby," he said. "In April, I think," she said. He held her hands and looked at her with that expression she would never stop being grateful for and said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "I am very well," she said, "and a little frightened. But mostly the good kind." He nodded. "Me too," he said. "The good kind." Clara, when told, had a number of practical concerns about sleeping arrangements and the noise levels she could anticipate and the question of whether the baby would be allowed to touch her rock collection. These were negotiated with great seriousness. She ultimately decided that a baby would be acceptable provided it turned out to be a good one, which Frederick solemnly promised to try to arrange. The baby came in April of 1880, as predicted, on a bright Tuesday morning when the apple trees in the east field were just beginning to flower. It was a boy. Maria and Frederick had not spoken about preferences, both of them the particular kind of sensible people who understood that preferences in this matter were somewhat beside the point. But she saw his face when the baby was handed to him, and knew that a son was something that reached into him somewhere deep, that the thing he held was not just a baby, but a beginning he had not known he was still capable of. They named him Thomas, because it was right. There was a conversation about it, quiet and serious and tender, Maria sitting propped against the headboard and Frederick at the edge of the bed with the baby asleep against his chest, and she had said, "I want to name him Thomas. If that is all right with you, not as a replacement. There is no replacement for anything, but as a continuation, as the apple trees are a continuation." Frederick had looked at the sleeping baby and then at her and said, "It is exactly right. It is the best name we could give him. Little Thomas Bell Bailey." They gave him the full name, all of it, stitching the two histories together into one came into a house that was warm and full and completely his. Clara was, it turned out, an excellent older sister, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. She appointed herself Thomas's teacher from practically his first month of life, conducting what she described as educational sessions that primarily consisted of showing him her rock collection and explaining each specimen in detail. She was entirely serious about this. Thomas, who turned out to be a cheerful and largely unperturbable baby, received these lessons with equanimity. Elbert Grady, the bank manager, left Caldwell in the spring of 1880, transferred by the bank to another territory, and Maria felt something release when she heard it, not quite celebration, but the relief of having a particular shadow pass from the horizon. The new bank manager was a younger man named Parrish who had the quality of a person who had been hired to do a job rather than to exercise power, which was a considerable improvement. The town itself was changing, as all the trail towns were changing. The cattle drives were beginning to come less frequently now that the railroad was reaching further south and cutting into the trail routes, and there was a sense in Caldwell of a town making itself into something different, less of a staging ground for transit and more of a real, permanent community, with people who intended to stay and build and make something that would last past the next season. Maria felt this shift and was glad of it. Permanence suited her. In the fall of 1880, when Thomas was 6 months old and Clara had started second grade at the Caldwell schoolhouse, and the apple trees had their first small, hard, promising fruits, Frederick came into the kitchen one evening with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Maria had learned to read as something to say, the look he got when he had been thinking something through and had arrived at a conclusion. "I want to talk about the farm," he said, "about making it official." The deed is in your name, as it should be, and I am not suggesting any change to that. But I want to talk about making an investment. Buying the cattle north of us, Hendricks is selling and adding acreage, making this a real working cattle operation, not just a subsistence farm. Maria put down the dish she was drying and looked at him. How much? Hendricks wants 160 for the herd, 40 head, and 220 for the land. $380, she said immediately. Yes, I have 230 still put by from before. We would need to borrow the rest, and I have spoken to Parrish at the bank, who says the terms are reasonable. Show me the terms, she said. He laid them on the table. She read every word, as she always did. She asked 4 questions, 2 of which he had anticipated and 2 of which made him pause and think, which was exactly what she was looking for. They talked through it for 2 hours, at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning and Thomas asleep in his cradle nearby and Clara upstairs doing her lessons. And at the end of the 2 hours, Maria said, "Let's do it." The farm grew. It was not easy. Nothing on the frontier was ever simply easy. There was always the weather and the market prices and the animal losses and the 1,000 small emergencies that farming generates in the normal course of events. But it was good. The work was good. The life was good. They built a partnership that was equal in the truest sense, not in identical tasks but in mutual respect, each of them bringing what they were best at to the whole, and the whole being stronger for it. Maria expanded her kitchen garden into something genuinely productive, vegetables and herbs and flowers, because she had decided that flowers were not impractical but necessary. That beauty was not a luxury on the frontier, but a statement about what you believed life was for. She sold vegetables in town through the summer and fall, and the money was real. She taught herself to make cheese from the milk of 2 cows they added in 1881, and the cheese was good enough that Simmons at the general merchandise store started stocking it, and that became its own small enterprise that gave her something that was purely hers. Frederick expanded the cattle operation steadily and ran it with the same combination of practicality and care that he applied to everything, and he was well regarded in Caldwell as a straight dealer and a competent rancher, a man whose word was reliable and whose business was sound. He was not a showy man, and he did not need to be known. He needed to do good work and to be home by evening and to sit at the kitchen table with his family. And these were the things he had, and the things he kept. Clara grew into a serious, determined, deeply curious 12-year-old in 1884, who wanted to know everything about everything and had opinions about all of it. And her teacher, a young woman from Illinois named Miss Ellison, told Maria that she was the best student she had ever taught and should be sent to the school in Wichita for secondary education when the time came. Maria and Frederick discussed this seriously and decided that when Clara was 15 they would make it happen, because Clara deserved everything her mind could reach for. Thomas was 4 in the summer of 1884, a sturdy, cheerful boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quick intelligence, and a personality that was entirely his own, decisive, affectionate, already deeply interested in the cattle and the horses in a way that would give Frederick someone to walk beside through the work in years to come. In the late fall of 1884, Maria told Frederick there would be another baby. He was building a section of fence when she told him, standing in the field in the October light that was doing that particular golden thing it did at that time of year, and he stood and looked at her and said, "Another one." "Another one," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, the same way he always was with large news. Then he set down his tools and came to her and held her, there in the field, with the cold October air around them and the apple trees visible in the east, half of them still holding their fruit, and she felt the warmth of him through her coat, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood like that for a moment, 2 people who had found each other on a difficult road and had built something real at the end of it. "Are you well?" he asked, as he always did. "Very well," she said. "Very, very well." The baby came in June of 1885, A girl this time, a bright and loud and immediately opinionated girl whom they named Helen, after Maria's mother, with Maria Belle Bailey's stubbornness and Frederick Bailey's watchful eyes, and a disposition that made everyone who met her feel that the world had better be prepared. When Helen was a few weeks old and Clara was walking through the field with Thomas, teaching him the names of plants with the same dedicated pedagogy she had once applied to the rock collection, and Frederick was in the barn with a lantern and a difficult piece of harness that needed mending, Maria sat in the kitchen in the summer evening with her baby daughter asleep against her chest, and looked out the window at the last of the light going gold, and then pink, and then the deep purple of a plain sunset. And she thought about the morning she had walked into Harlan Coop's funeral parlor in a black dress with a folded deed in her fist. She thought about standing at the counter and asking for one more day. One day. Please, just one more day. She thought about the noon sun on the road from town, the sound of hooves that could have been any horse carrying any stranger, and the man who had stopped at the gate and touched his hat and said he was looking for the Bell place. One more day. That was all she had asked for. And into that one day, as if the world had been holding it in reserve for exactly this moment, had walked everything that came after. The apple trees in the east field that were Thomas Bell's dream, and were real now and bore fruit every fall. The farm that stood and the herd that grew and the books that balanced and the cheese in Simmons's store. Clara's serious face over her lessons. Thomas with his father's eyes. Helen asleep against her chest. The life she had not known she was going to have. She looked out the window at the Kansas sky, that enormous, faithful sky that was indifferent to human suffering and human joy alike, that stretched from here to forever in every direction. And she felt the completeness of it, not the absence of sadness, because sadness was always there, woven through, that permanent thread of Thomas Bell who had planted apple trees in her heart before he died, but the fullness. The genuine, earned, unexpected fullness of a life that had not ended when she thought it might, that had kept going and growing and bringing new things through the gate at noon on October days. Frederick came in from the barn a while later, pulling the door shut behind him against the evening chill, and he saw her in the lamplight with the baby and came and sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean, fully and without reserve. "All right?" he asked. "Better than all right," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair and looked at the sleeping baby and didn't say anything else, because nothing else needed saying. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the flat land the way it always would, indifferent and constant, and carrying the smell of grass and distance. And inside, the lamp was warm and the people were home. Clara lived the life that Miss Ellison had predicted. She went to school in Wichita at 15, and came home every summer with more books and more questions and more absolute certainty about the world. And the farm received her each time like a good dock receives a ship, with steadiness and welcome and no demand for explanation. She studied and then studied more and ultimately became a teacher herself, the kind who would be remembered by her students for the rest of their lives, which was what Clara Belle Bailey had always been intended to become. Thomas grew into the work of the farm with a naturalness and a love for it that was genuine, not obligated. By the time he was 12, he was doing real work alongside Frederick. Not child's work, but the actual labor of a functioning cattle operation. And he and his father worked together with the ease of people who understand each other without much need for words. In the evenings, Frederick taught him the things he had learned on the trail, reading weather, reading land, reading animals, and Thomas received these lessons the way a good field receives rain, taking them in completely and making them his own. Helen was a force of nature from birth and remained one. She was strong-willed and brilliant and funny and difficult in the best possible way, and she and Maria had the particular relationship of two people who are very similar and therefore sometimes at odds and always fundamentally on each other's side. Frederick, who was the person in the house least susceptible to being managed, was her favorite, which is the way of these things. Years passed the way years do on a working farm, not quietly, because farms are never quiet, but with a rhythm that made them feel held, made them feel like the days were going somewhere rather than simply passing. The cattle operation grew to something that was a real business, not a survival exercise. The apple trees grew and grew and bore, 12 of them now somehow, Thomas having planted 3 more in the east field at 13, as if making good on his namesake's original dream with compound interest. Maria Bell Bailey, who had walked into a funeral parlor with a folded deed and asked for one more day, had given herself a whole life instead. On a morning in October of 1888, 10 years to the month from the morning, she had stood in Harlan Coop's doorway in her black dress. She woke early and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over the flat Kansas horizon the way she had watched it come up that day, that long-ago terrible morning, before everything changed. The light was the same, that clean, hard October blue beginning to warm at the edges. The grass in the yard was the same gold and rust. The chickens were making their morning noise at the coop, which had been rebuilt and expanded twice since Clara's childhood ministrations. Frederick came downstairs while she was standing there, his hair still disheveled from sleep, making his way to the coffee pot with the comfortable ease of a man in his own home, and he paused when he saw her face turn to the window with that particular look. "Thinking about something," he said. "October," she said. "Thinking about October." He came and stood beside her at the window, and they both looked out at the morning together, the 10 years gone morning and the this morning occupying the same space in the way that time has of folding back on itself when you have lived somewhere long enough for memory to saturate the air. "I was so frightened," she said. It was not a complaint. It was just the truth, remembered. "I know," he said. "You didn't show it. I was showing it. I was just showing the other side of it." She turned to look at him. He was 42 years old, and the trail years were in his face in a way that suited him, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver beginning at his temples, all of it worn well and honestly. "Frederick, Maria, I have a very good life," she said. It was simple and complete. He looked at her the way he always had, that steady, warm, fully present look, the look that said she was being seen entirely. "So do I," he said. The coffee finished brewing, and they poured it and sat down at the kitchen table together while the rest of the house slept, the October morning coming in golden through the east window. And outside, the apple trees in the east field were weighted with their fall fruit, Thomas Bell's impossible dream made real and given back to the world year after year, steadfast and sweet and still growing. One more day had been everything.